Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, John Titus. John holds a master's degree in electrical engineering as well as a law degree. John also is a staunch critic of the central banking system, and his diligent research has uncovered numerous lies and deceptions from the U.S. Federal Reserve regarding their actions policies since 2008. John is the creator and executive producer of Best Evidence, his YouTube channel. All his documentaries are on there, and he has a new documentary coming out very, very soon. And I am very, very happy to have John on the X22 Report Spotlight. John, welcome to the Spotlight.
Dave, thanks for having me back.
Thanks for being here. I really appreciate you coming on once again. And you have this new documentary coming out, and you sent me the introduction to this new documentary, and it seems very, very interesting, and you gave me a little bit of a rundown of what it's about. Can you just tell everyone a little bit about what you are putting out there and what it's all about?
This documentary, called All the Plenary's Men, is a sequel to the last one I did, which was The Veneer of Justice in a Kingdom of Crime. And this one really gets to the ultimate question, which is, who is the real sovereign authority in the United States? Because if you look at the prosecutorial history of the Department of Justice with the big banks, it is very difficult at this point to conclude that the banks don't have criminal immunity. They do have criminal immunity because they never go to jail. And that's a real problem because, I don't know if you've ever seen the William Blackstone quote. Blackstone was a legal scholar in England hundreds of years ago, and he put a very succinct formulation out in which he said, the king can do no wrong. And basically what that means is the king, and no one else, the king can commit crimes with impunity. Meaning he'll never be punished. He can commit whatever crimes he wants, and that's that. There's no legal remedy for that at all. And now, at this point, following 8 years of malfeasance in the Justice Department, it now looks like a group of banks, in fact, can do no wrong. And if that's the case, then we've got a real problem, because it means that the big banks, or someone the big banks are representing, are really the true sovereign in the U.S. It's not the president. It's not Congress. It's not the courts. It's the banks or someone behind the banks. And the way this comes to light in the heft of the film is there was a report that came out last year by Republican members of the House Financial Services Committee. And the report came out in July, so it was right in the middle of the presidential circus, the political circus. And maybe for that reason, the report really didn't get the attention it deserved. But that report goes into why it was that HSBC, which is the huge British bank, they admitted that they were laundering money on behalf of terrorists and on behalf of drug dealers, and yet the bank wasn't prosecuted and no one at the bank was prosecuted. And that House report, the House Financial Services Committee report, gets into why they didn't get prosecuted. And what's interesting about that report is it reveals that yeah, there were prosecutors in the DOJ who were planning to indict HSBC, and Lanny Brewer and Eric Holder called off the dogs. And that story is in large part what this film that I've just done is about, because it covers a lot of ground, because there's a lot to how HSBC's exoneration came about. So we got to go all the way over to England and then come all the way back over here to really dot all the I's, across all the T's. It's an interesting story.
So what you're saying is that these banks and those people behind the curtain, they have a separate set of laws for themselves, and the people have a different set of laws.
That's a good way of putting. Yeah, that's correct. And that's a good way of putting it. In other words, everybody knows that you should not have a two-tiered system of justice. And while we're pretty much familiar with one tier of justice, namely the one that applies to us, no one ever talks about, well, what does the second tier look like? It's not like these guys are making decisions and doing things at random. They're not. There's a set of rules in place. And this film, All the Plenary's Men, gets into what those rules are. They're out there.
So who is actually running this country? I mean, we use names like deep state, neocons, central bankers. From your research, who is behind the curtain here? Who's running the country?
Well, insofar as the banks are concerned, The banks are running the country. Who is ultimately running it? I don't really know. I don't know who the king is. And one of the reasons I titled the film "All the Plenary's Men" is that there's a group of bankers in Basel, Switzerland, that calls itself the Plenary, and they are controlling things in the U.S. They certainly have full control of the Justice Department, and they're calling the shots. I can't answer the ultimate question of, who is behind the curtain, but I don't, from my way of thinking, I don't really need to answer that question. I can't get to the king, and I don't need to get to the king. What I need, and what I think people need to understand, is that we need to get to the king's men, right? I don't know if you know this, but, in 1215, when the Magna Carta was signed, 150 years later, as people began to process, what does the rule of law mean? If the law is the ultimate authority, then the king's men shouldn't be allowed to do all these things that they're doing. And the impeachment process started back in the 1300s and into the 1400s and 1500s. And if you look at the kinds of things that, rich serfs would complain about, the grounds for impeachment of the king's men, they sound remarkably like the things that you and I and other people complain about now. The abuse of authority, the abuse of law, the rewarding of cronies who are unworthy with lavish, financial positions for no other reason that they do your bidding. All of these things were grounds for impeachment several centuries ago. And what that reveals is that, those impeachment articles were never directed at the king himself, because as Blackstone said, the king could do no wrong, but we can get to his men. So the people in the U.S. who are doing wrong are the people who took an oath to uphold the laws of the United States and to uphold the Constitution, and then turn right around and answer to a group of bankers. That's a problem. We can do something about that.
When you say bankers, you're including the Fed, the central bank, in this?
Oh, most certainly. Certainly the Federal Reserve, which is, they have the sovereign power to coin money, and the U.S. Treasury. Those two are included. But those are both controlled. They're controlled by a group of banks. Basically, there's a formal group of too big to fail banks out there, and those banks are identified as globally, systemically important financial institutions by a group operating in the Bank for International Settlements, and that group goes by the name of the Financial Stability Board, which sounds like an innocuous, that's a benign, good thing. These guys are all about helping us with financial stability. Well, what does stability mean? It's just a cover. It's just a front for the banking cartel. And this list of globally systemically important financial institutions, what's called SIFIs, that's the cartel. There you go. Those banks are above the law.
You know what I noticed when you mentioned the names of these different systems? They always pick names that make it sound good, that it's, it's for the people. Like, it's the Federal Reserve, or even bills that the government puts out, the Patriot Act, the, Affordable Care. It's all good for you. But yeah. And it's always the opposite. All these things of.
Yeah, we're from the government. We're here to help you.
Yeah. And it's always the opposite. All these things of, where they come up with these names, it's completely the opposite. It's never for the people whatsoever. So we know that there were certain banks that were involved in, let's say, gold and silver manipulation in the LIBOR scandal. You mentioned HSBC with drug money laundering, and nothing ever happened to these banks. I mean, yeah, they get fines here and there, but the amount of money that they make on these operations they have are a lot more than the fines they do receive. And the government, well, they don't touch them whatsoever, ever.
No. And I'll tell you something about those so-called fines. They're not fines. How many parking tickets have you gotten? Let's say you've gotten 50 parking tickets in your life. How many times have you gone into the government and negotiated the amount of the fine down? The answer is 0. These guys, they negotiate the amount down every time. In fact, as I show in this film, they set the fine. They decide on the cost of doing business, and then they forward supporting documentation to U.S. authorities, and the U.S. authorities relabel it as a fine to prop up this illusion that somehow, we have a constitutional republic and everything is, going according to plan.
So how do we get to these individuals? Is it possible? I mean, you're doing research, exposing this. And since we know the president isn't really in control, and we never thought, I never thought he was ever in control. We always knew there was a group behind the scenes. But how can we possibly get this group out of power? Is it possible?
At this point, I'm beginning to wonder. I'm starting to think that revolution may be the only way, but the formal way to do it would be to go to, write your congressman, write your congressional representatives and demand that they, launch an investigation into what the Department of Justice is doing. When the Republicans put out that report last July about HSBC, the Department of Justice, which at that time was run by Loretta Lynch, who had succeeded Eric Holder, the Department of Justice didn't turn over a single piece of paper. Despite multiple subpoenas, the Justice Department completely stonewalled Congress. And the remedy for that, when that happens, is that Congress needs then to demand a special prosecutor. And that never happened. And that's a really big tell to me. They didn't give you a single piece of paper and you don't call for a special prosecutor. Let me back up. You need a special prosecutor. The role of a special prosecutor is to step in to the shoes of the Attorney General when the Attorney General has some conflict of interest in a given case. And in Loretta Lynch's case in HSBC, she had not one conflict, but two. First, because she was part of the stonewalling effort, not turning over any documents. But before that, guess who the prosecutor of the HSBC case was? It was Loretta Lynch in Brooklyn. So she was doubly conflicted. And even though that was the case, it was undisputed, nobody ever asked for a special prosecutor. What they did is they put out their report in July of 2016, and that was that. They washed their hands. Now, had they waited, they could have gone in theory, and in theory they could still go to Jeff Sessions and say, hey, these documents that you're hiding about the HSBC case, turn them over. There's not even a political reason for you not to do that. All you'd be doing is implicating Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. Who cares about them, right? But I guarantee you two things. One, Sessions isn't going to turn over those documents either. And two, Congress will never do anything about it because they're controlled by the banking cartel too. All of them are controlled by the banking cartel.
Congress right now, when we look at it, is completely corrupt, receiving free money from the central bank and corporations. And we can see they have not done anything for the people for a very long time. They do it.
Well, if you think about it, if it's true that the real sovereign power in the U.S. isn't the U.S. government, then it's not their job to represent you at all.
That's true.
Their job is to carry out orders from the real sovereign power in the U.S. And they're doing a wonderful job at that.
I want to go back to 2008 when we had the financial meltdown at that point, and the banks came out and they kind of scared Congress into giving money to the banking system. Because every time there is something that happens, I noticed that governments or those people behind the curtain, central bank, they always use some type of scare tactic, like, something's going to happen. Like let's take, for instance, the Brexit. Well, if the UK leaves, we're going to have a financial meltdown. Things are going to be, completely terrible. Everything's going to melt down. It's not going to work out. Back in 2008, if we don't get this money, the economy is going to come to an end. And they continually use these scare tactics. And we're coming up most likely to and everything that I've been looking at, another financial crisis. And these bankers are, they're going to use the same exact tactics as they did before to say, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen.
Right. And let me, so those are two different parts. There's what happened in 2008 and what's coming. They're two great questions. 2008 was really interesting. I actually get a little bit of hope from 2008 because what really scared Congress wasn't the banks. Congress was already in the pocket of the banks by then. What was interesting in that, if you remember on September 29th, the first time the vote for TARP came up in the House, it failed. And the
Yes.
reason it failed is that people were so angry and had written and faxed and emailed Congress in unprecedented waves that that's what scared Congress. Now, 4 days later, they got it together after a few bribes and a few threats, and they passed TARP. But the real thing that scared Congress was the people. You know, that therein lies your clue to how to rein in this government, is get the American people, who are well armed, incidentally, pissed off. That puts them in line. But the interesting thing about the crisis, there's a lot of interesting things that happen in the crisis, and the scare tactics is a big part of it, and that's certainly key. They invent all these stories that are totally ludicrous, and one of the stories was that there was a drawdown in the money market system, and that $550 billion had been withdrawn from the system over the course of 2 hours. That story actually didn't surface during that meltdown. That actually was originated by Paul Kanjorski in March of 2009 in a C-SPAN interview. The actual story is that the drawdown occurred over the course of, I think, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. It was $150 billion, no real big deal, and it was stopped on September 20th by a promise from the Treasury to back up the money market system to the tune of $50 billion. That was all it took, and that little crisis was over. And yet, even now, people point to that as a reason that we needed TARP. But that crisis was done by September 20th, and TARP didn't pass until October 3rd. So that story doesn't work. The really interesting thing to me, though, about that meltdown in September was that if you look at the bank stocks during that time, let's say from September 1st to October 3rd, when TARP passed, Goldman Sachs stock goes down about 20%. JP Morgan stock went up 20%. And the reason for that, to my way of thinking, is that the market had sniffed out the fact that JP Morgan was already, that the Federal Reserve was already backing up JP Morgan. The market knew that. And the way the market knew that was from the bailout of JP Morgan in the Bear Stearns meltdown the previous March. Everybody thinks that was a bailout of Bear Stearns bondholders. It wasn't. It was a bailout of JP Morgan. There's an options trader in Chicago named John O'Legs who wrote an article about that, and he details exactly what happened in that meltdown. But the point about, the contrast between Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan is that during that meltdown in September, nobody really knew what the score was. Nobody really knew who was in control. But the market had seemed to sniff out the fact that JP Morgan was backed up by the Fed. And it wasn't until later that we now kind of know, looking at the course of events, that it's really Goldman Sachs who's calling the shots. I think anybody who had any doubt about that just needs to take one look at the Trump administration, and that should extinguish all doubt.
Yeah, I do believe that Goldman, they have their hands in everything. And you can just see from the 2008 crisis moving forward that they are controlling the entire situation with the central bank. And what's very interesting, I think, is every time that the central bankers, the bankers come out and say the sky is going to fall, I get the feeling that if we don't do what they say, their system is going to fall. And this is why they actually need the funds. They're really reflecting on themselves, saying, listen, if you don't do what we say, we will not be able to exist anymore. And the system, the way we're keeping it and the way we have it right now, will come down.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. In fact, if you look at the granular story that they told at the time, the particular story, forgetting the drawdown story, that one I've already debunked. There was a second story that they trotted out, and that was that the commercial paper market was melting down, and that was the linkage that they were trying to plump between Wall Street and Main Street. In other words, if Wall Street goes down, Main Street's coming down with it due to commercial paper. Well, I got bad news for you on that one too. The Federal Reserve itself looked at all the evidence in support of the commercial paper story and concluded that story was false. That in fact, non-financial institution commercial paper throughout the teeth of the crisis didn't even show a blip. That it was all financial commercial paper, meaning commercial paper from the bank, non-financial commercial paper for the most part, meaning commercial paper, short-term IOUs written by mom and pop businesses. The non-financial commercial paper market didn't even flinch during the crisis. It was the commercial paper market did. So that story fails too. But it's always a scare tactic. The other element to it is these banks are organized crime. So when they come to you and say the sky is falling, what they're really saying is, you got a nice family here, Dave. Be ashamed if something happened to them. That's what that really is.
Yeah, absolutely true. So from your investigation and from what you've been looking at, what else have you found out that you can tell us right now?
There's a reason that Trump has walked back a lot of his campaign promises. I mean, he sounded fantastic on the campaign trail. He was saying the things that all of us wanted to hear. And now, he's not going to prosecute Hillary. He's not going to rein in Obamacare and on and on. And that gets to the fact that Trump is not, he's the president, but the president's not the sovereign. He's not calling the shots. That's not his job. He's a manager for the powers that be. He's a manager for the banks. He's a manager for this cartel of criminal banks. And that's a disastrous thing because, one of the previous questions you would ask me is what happens in the next meltdown. And at this point, where you don't have the rule of law anymore, they don't even need a bailout anymore. They just do whatever they want because nothing's going to happen.
So when you say that when the next financial crisis comes along, I mean, in your mind, what do you think they're going to do?
Take your bank accounts.
So you think they're going to use those bail-in documents, or do you think they're just going to forget that?
No, I think that's existing law. As far as I can tell, what's so astonishing is that no one's really writing about it. Can you direct me to any article written by somebody that it kind of walks people through what happens in the next financial meltdown? First of all, people say there won't be bailouts. I don't buy that. If there needs to be bailouts to prop these guys up, there's going to be bailouts. They'll loot the Treasury again. But the real question is, what's going to happen to commercial bank accounts? Because I look at FDIC puts out a quarterly report called Statistics at a Glance. You have roughly $12 trillion in commercial bank accounts, and I think about $7 trillion of that is insured. There's $4 trillion that's uninsured for people who have over $250,000 in their account. That's mostly, smaller businesses. That money, as far as I'm concerned, is gone. Why would you not help yourself to it? Because when you go and deposit $100 in a bank, you don't own that money anymore. You become legally an unsecured creditor. And you have a claim on that money, and the odds are very high that you'll be able to get that money. But legally, it's not your money. You're merely an unsecured creditor, and you have an inferior legal position to the secured creditors and to the super secured creditors, who are the counterparties in the derivatives bets that the commercial banks are making. Do you follow me? So in other words, if Citigroup, to use this example as a bank, if Citigroup starts to totter and its counterparties on its derivatives get worried that Citigroup may buckle and fall, those counterparties, who are other too big to fail banks, can reach into Citigroup and grab assets. And those assets include money that you've put into the bank, because it's not your money anymore. You're an unsecured creditor. So you tell me in the next meltdown, given the size of the derivatives market, what's going to happen, given everything we've seen from these banks. They break the law with total impunity. They loot the Treasury. Nothing happens. And we're going to have another meltdown, and you don't think they're going to reach in and grab $4 million or $12 trillion from commercial bank accounts? You're insane.
So let me just get this straight so I can understand and other people can understand. Now, in Cyprus, they had capital controls. They went into the bank and they replaced it with worthless bank stock. Won't they do the same thing again? Again, I always see them doing something saying, well, this is going to benefit you. We're going to take your currency right now, but don't worry, we're replacing it with this bank stock. And many people, correct me if I'm wrong, many people will think, well, okay, they're giving me bank stock right now. Everything is okay because I have another piece of paper, which is digital, in my account.
Yeah, well, let me know how that works out. Have you ever met anybody who had an FDIC claim for a failed bank? I haven't. I don't know how that works. I don't know how those things work, So yeah, you might have bank stock, but how much is that bank stock going to be worth? I mean, the collateral's gone.
But I'm just saying to keep the people feeling like everything is still okay. Yes, we took your currency, but we replaced it. And I see the central bank, the banking system, the government trying to calm the situation down. I'm not saying it's a good situation. I'm just saying they're going to trick the people like they always do to make them feel like they did in Cyprus. Well, don't worry. We took your money, but we replaced it with something else, and you should feel okay now. And I'm just wondering how the American people are going to react to that.
I don't know. I mean, how can you spend bank stock at a store? I can't. I can spend cash when I go buy groceries. I can't whip out bank stock or IOUs or any other commercial paper. I use cash. That's what works. Cash and credit cards. That's it. Now, when I say banks, I want to be clear. I'm talking about commercial banks, that you bank at, right? Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Bank of America, JP Morgan, those. Other institutions, when you put money in, let's say you have a Schwab investment account. When you put money in a Schwab cash account, that's actually your money. Your legal status is better surprisingly. It's somebody like Schwab than it is a commercial bank. The commercial banks is where the problem is. But I don't know. Yeah, they'll do whatever they can to try to prop up the confidence of the American people, whether it's through bank stock or shiny certificates on your iPhone or whatever they got to do. But if you can't spend it, you're going to have do you know what a food riot looks like? I don't, and I don't want to know.
The only ones I've seen are in other countries where shelves have gone empty and people fighting over a piece of meat. Never really saw it here. The only thing I think that people might have seen here is during the holiday season where people are fighting over a DVD player in Walmart and they're stepping on people.
That's a new Christmas tradition, isn't it?
Yes.
The Walmart brawl video.
So, that's why, with the banking system, they will most likely implement capital controls because there'll be no currency to take out. They'll have to control how much you can take out because they've taken most of it. And this is going to be, from my point of view, this is going to be a huge, huge problem across the country. And I know there's many others who out there saying the same thing that you are, that all this is basically just going to disappear.
I don't know what's going to happen, but there's a reason that these maniacs are trying to outlaw cash, right? Because if you don't have cash, you don't have control. You're totally dependent on an electronic system that's run by criminals. That's horrifying. It's especially horrifying if you ever listen to the interview of John Cruz done by, I think, Richard Grove at Tragedy and Hope magazine. And Cruz says that, HSBC, like Wells Fargo, was opening accounts in people's names unbeknownst to the bank customers. And they were pumping tens of millions of dollars through those accounts before they closed the account. Well, guess what? They would open the account on Thursday. And when they went to close the account, they would close it on Wednesday, the day before. So the computer would look at that and go, well, that's not even real. You can't close an account, before you open the account. So that's not a real account. And it vanished. The account would vanish off the audit trail.
Wait a minute. You're telling me they opened up an account on Thursday and they closed it on the day before? How is that even possible?
You tell me, because it's done in computer system. That's why you change the code in a computer. You do whatever you want. But the point of that is what Cruz was saying is the reason that HSBC was doing that is so that those accounts would vanish from the audit trail as if they never existed. When John Cruz became a whistleblower, he said the first thing that happened when I became a whistleblower, because I saw all these accounts being opened and closed, I was watching it in real time. He said the day after I started blowing the whistle about this and running it up the flagpole within HSBC, the next thing I saw was that an illegal account opened in my name. Now, these people play for keeps.
So how do we know? There could be, all the commercial banks could be doing this right now.
Yeah, correct.
We wouldn't even know it.
Correct. Because one of the things I show in the film is that the banks aren't investigated. The banks handle their own investigation. The DOJ doesn't investigate the too big to fail banks at all. Yeah, it might look at some reports and stuff but as far as going in and doing the audit themselves, nah. They let the bank do that. They let the criminals investigate the criminals. That's why no one's being prosecuted. It's one of the many reasons.
That's just mind-boggling. That's just ridiculous that the criminal is investigating their own crime.
Yeah, that's been going on for a long time. Moreover, I show something else in the film, which is the crimes going unprosecuted, the crimes that aren't prosecuted, are the official business of the bank. Let that one sink in. So when HSBC doesn't get prosecuted for laundering money for terrorists and drug dealers, that's because it's HSB's official business to launder money for drug dealers and terrorists. That's what it does. That's why they're not prosecuted. Now, it's not as if no bankers, if you're a banker for a too big to fail bank and you want to get prosecuted, here's what you do. Just do something on behalf of yourself. Go do some insider trading on inside information, make a bunch of money that way, because that's not official bank business. That's a good way to get yourself in jail. Do something for yourself rather than the bank. But as long as what you're doing is for the bank, you walk on water. Fact.
So, I mean, just because it's official bank procedures, even if these official bank procedures are against the law, they're still against the law.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, and what we were talking about at the beginning, the law doesn't really matter if the U.S. government isn't the real sovereign in the U.S. If the real sovereign is the banks themselves, the banks are the law.
Right. So under their law, this is official bank business. So you're okay with that. I see what you're saying here.
I'm not okay with it.
No, not you, but I'm saying that the people behind the curtain, the banks are okay with that, and everything else is fine.
Ding.
And if you do insider trading or you leak information from the bank, well, that's completely against our rules and our secondary laws that you don't know about.
Yeah, you're not helping us. You're not helping the team. You're helping yourself. So off to prison with you. That's what got Raj Gupta of Goldman Sachs in prison. That's what got Raj Rajaratnam of Galleon Hedge Fund, which is a non-cartel member, into prison. Insider trading. There was even a trader at Credit Suisse who went to prison. Jesse Eisinger wrote a piece in 2014 about that, but he wasn't doing what his bosses wanted. And there was a great journalist for I think it was Bloomberg named Jonathan Weil, and Weil was a stand-up dude. I used to write to him when I was kind of getting into this stuff. You're like, what is that? He would write back, and he would tell the truth too. But he's no longer. He's no longer a reporter for Bloomberg or anywhere, as far as I know. The people telling the truth. They're not part of it.
Yeah.
Nah.
They don't stay around that long.
Their shelf life is shorter than the propagandists. It all gets down to what's your real job. Who's the real sovereign? Are you helping the real? Are you helping the real sovereign, or aren't you? Because the real sovereign is not the president. It's not Congress. It's not the U.S. government. It's not the courts. The real sovereign is the too big to fail banks, or somebody the too big to fail banks answers to. Those are your two choices.
Now, have you ever come across what the goal or what they're trying to accomplish with everything here?
No, I haven't. And you can only, I can only speculate on what that might be based on patterns that you see over time. Certainly an overarching goal or an intermediary goal is control. Because, and the reason I say that is that the goal is not the accumulation of money, because the criminals have control of the printing press. They can print as much money as they want.
That's true.
That's not the goal. The goal is not for them to get more money. It's to take away and have control over your money. And they will have total control as soon as the entire currency system is electronic. At that point, it's game over. They've got total control. Because if they can disappear your account, yeah, you're nothing. You're in deep trouble.
So if we're moving to this electronic type of currency because they want to get rid of cash, I mean, they've been talking about this for quite a while right now. From your research, how do they view Bitcoin? Have you come across anything with that?
I wouldn't touch Bitcoin with a 10-foot pole because it's electronic. Who runs Bitcoin? Do you know for a fact who runs Bitcoin? Who's behind it? Who wrote the algos for Bitcoin? I don't know either. So I would not go anywhere near Bitcoin. That has all the wrong signs. Sort of like Edward Snowden, right? The guy comes out of nowhere. He's got all these documents. Nobody knows how many. He can't even keep his own story straight on how many documents he reviewed. I've reviewed documents professionally, and when somebody says one day they reviewed 8,000 documents and the next day it's 1.2 million, they're lying. And Edward Snowden has all this backing. In other words, he's being pushed by the media. I'm super wary. I stay as far away from the mainstream media as is human possibly. And when I see somebody being propped up by the media, I'm very wary. And for that reason, all the hype over Bitcoin, I'd be wary.
John, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. When do you expect your documentary to be out?
Well, I hope it's out on Friday, the 28th. But I tell you, it's been a real white whale for me to get this thing done. So that's a goal, but it's not a promise.
Thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I'm going to put the link to your YouTube channel at the bottom of this video. So everyone who's listening, all you have to do is click on that link and it'll bring you right to his YouTube channel, make it a lot easier to view his documentary when it comes out. And you can view his other documentaries that he already has on his YouTube channel. John, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight.
Thank you, Dave. Always a pleasure.